Today's lecture is going to focus on dealing with data sets that have missing data. When R gets a data table from, say, an Excel file, and there isn't a value in one of the cells, it doesn't just put nothing there. It'll insert the placeholder NA. And the problem with this is when you go to analyze this data set, if you want to do any sort of calculations on it, oftentimes it won't work if you've got any NAs in your data. So in this lecture, we're going to learn how to get rid of rows or columns with NAs in them, and we're going to learn how to replace those NAs with other values if you don't want to completely take them out of your data set. Here I've made two example vectors. Both of them have NA values in them, so I'm going to run both of these to load them into my environment. And now I'm going to make a data frame with both of them. I'm going to call it sad table because it's missing data points. So the first thing we're going to do is subset the data so that we only get rows where the incomplete column has a value. So to do this, we're going to use our bracket subsetting. We're going to save it into a new element called happy table. We're going to say we want sad table, and we're specifying, remember it's rows comma columns, so we're taking both columns. We don't want to get rid of one of these two columns completely, but we're going to say rows. We're going to specify sad table, the column incomplete, when this column is not NA. So this looks a little weird, but remember this exclamation point means not. So we're saying the opposite of is NA. So if I didn't have the exclamation point in here, we would get just the elements in the incomplete column where it is NA. But here we're saying when it's the opposite of NA. So if we run this, then it saves a new table called happy table, and we're going to just check this out and see what it did. So before we had a bunch of NA values in our incomplete column, but now we have no NAs, so we know that it's worked. And it's just taken out those rows. And we can see which ones we took out because we have a row names column that's automatically generated, and we see row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but there's no row 7, and that's because incomplete had an NA in row 7, so we've taken it out completely. Now all that's left to do with this data frame is do the exact same thing to this column. We just need to take up this row because it has an NA in it. So we're going to go back to our code. Now we're going to make a new data frame, and we're going to call it really happy table. And we're going to say this new data frame where the incomplete column is cleaned up. And we're going to say the exact same thing. We're going to just copy this code basically and paste it down here. But we're going to say when happy table is messed up. So this is specifying we're looking at the messed up column, and we're saying when that column is not NA, we're going to save it into really happy table. And again, we're keeping both columns so there's an empty space after this comma. And we're going to run this. And now if we look at this table, you can see it's slightly different. All it's different is it's taken out row 2 because that had an NA in it. So now we've got a completely cleaned up data frame that's ready to be analyzed. The second situation I want to talk about is when we don't want to completely strip out those rows because they might have important information in there. So an example of when this might happen is if you've got an Excel spreadsheet and there are a bunch of zeros, but whoever's been entering the data didn't write a 0, they just left it blank, which normally would be okay. But as you remember, when we import that file into R, it's not going to automatically put in a 0 there, even though there should be a 0. It's going to put an NA, and then we can't work with that. What we're going to learn now is how to take those NAs and replace them with zeros or any other value that you want to put in so that we're not completely getting rid of those rows and stripping that data out. So I've made two more example vectors to illustrate this. I've made number of cows and farmer ID number, and I've combined them into a data frame called cowstats. And with this data set, we want to do two things. Wherever there's an NA in the number of cows vector, we want to replace it with a 0. And whenever there's an NA in the farmer ID column, we want to completely strip it out. So we're going to do two things to this data frame. The first thing is to replace with 0. What we're going to do, and there are multiple ways of doing this. If you look up online, there are a bunch of different methods, but this is the way that I use. It may look a little confusing, so I'm going to walk you through the syntax of this line. We're taking the data frame as a whole, and we're specifying this specific column, number of cows, and we're using our brackets again to specify that, again, when cow stats is number of cows, when that is an NA, we're going to set it equal to 0. And if you remember the difference between the single equal sign and a double equal sign, I'll just remind you really quickly. A single equal sign is setting something equal to 0. So we're making this 0 equal that, whatever is over here. A double equal sign is a comparison. So that's when we want to say when a variable equals 0, as opposed to this where we're saying this actually equals 0, is we're setting it at 0. So if we run this, it's going to set all those equal to 0, and we're going to check. Let's look at, well, here, let's run this again. So I'm going to replace those zeros again. So before we do that, we're just going to look at cow stats as a whole, just so we know what we've changed. So here is the full data frame with all the NAs included. And so notice there are 10 rows, so that shouldn't change once we've run this line. We're going to set them all equal to 0, and then we're going to look at this again. And we see that we still have 10 rows, and all those NAs have been replaced with zeros. So that's perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. But now we still have to deal with the NAs in the farmer ID column. So to remove all those rows with farmer ID NAs, we're going to do the same thing that we did above. And we're going to take cow stats, and we're going to say when cow stats is in the column farmer ID, and we're going to say give me only rows where it is not NA, and we're going to save it into a new data frame. So that shows up over here, and we're going to view Happy Cow Stats, and notice that it went from 10 rows to 9 rows because it took out those NAs in the farmer ID column. So now we have a completely cleaned up data frame that's ready to use. In this lecture, we learned how to deal with NAs in our data frames, so missing values in our data frames. We learned how to both take out rows where there are NA values and also replace those NA values with any number that you want. This tool will really come in handy later on when we're importing our own data sets, because you'll find that very frequently you have missing data points that you're going to have to deal with.